I speak on behalf of myself and my two co-authors, Gabrielle Seid and Heathcliff Schembri. We're representing the Malta College of Art, Science and Technology, also known as MCAST. And we're presenting a project that was originally Gabrielle's as part of her undergraduate research. She studied inclusive education at MCAST. We eventually developed this into a paper, which we hope to share with you very soon. But today, I would like to just give you an overview of basically what we found and what we came up with. So the study was, at its core, it was about trying to measure or explore what the philosophical orientations of educators in Maltese primary schools are. Philosophical orientations and attitudes towards inclusion. We were interested in these two outcomes. So the study was pretty much about what is the situation out there, what are their philosophies and what are their attitudes towards inclusion? How do these interact and what factors influence those outcomes? So if we can measure, for instance, the role an educator is in, if they are a kindergarten educator or an LSE or a class teacher, does this help us to predict where they're at philosophically? Does this help us to predict what their attitudes to inclusion might be? So what are their philosophical orientations? What are their attitudes towards inclusion? How do these interact? And what are the factors that might influence those outcomes? So I've pretty much gone over what the scope and aims actually were. Now, to do that, this is challenging because obviously to measure philosophical orientations is a tricky thing. So how are we going to recognize and measure something like a philosophical orientation? So naturally, we came from a specific theoretical background. So this slide pretty much sums up the three main elements of our point of departure, of our own theoretical framework. Most of us in this room will be familiar with Ronald Sultana. Ronald Sultana wrote extensively about sociology and philosophy of education from a local perspective throughout the 1990s. So we started from there. So if we're going to recognize philosophy of education, let's make it locally contextualized. Let's try to delineate a philosophy that actually counts in the Maltese context. So Sultana was a great place to start. He wrote very much about the technocratic and humanistic divide. We can call this the vocationalist and humanistic divide. This has already come up in the previous talks. So do we see education as a route to work and employment and bolstering the economy, or do we see education as a route to developing active, engaged citizens who are more, who contribute to a society that is judged in its success, not in terms of economics, but in terms of something else, something more. So that was really, we said, okay, philosophical orientation, what do we mean by that? Let's start with Ronald Sultana. That, of course, happens within a context, so Peter Mayer is relevant here as well. Peter Mayer, highly critical in the Freirean sense, so the revolutionary sense, radical sense. So he identifies the neoliberal scourge, this tendency for us to think of everything in terms of markets, products, consuming those products. It's very easy to slip into this way of thinking. We use these terms all the time, terms that are associated with a neoliberal philosophy. So we talk about markets, we talk about individual choice as if it's a consumer's choice. So are students, are they consumers or are they human beings? Our educational institutions, are they educational institutions or are they corporations and businesses? So Mayo talks about this neoliberal scourge. So this is the context in which we are looking at philosophy. So I think that counts, so we incorporated this into our interpretive stance. And finally, an important aspect of context is that we do have inclusion as a relatively explicit and overt feature of our educational system. We know that Malta compares favorably to other countries in terms of how inclusive our education system is. So that's a feature of the context as well. So when we look at philosophy, we have to take into account these things. So that's what we did. So when we collected our data, we came from this place. So this was I'm talking about measurement, so we were trying to quantify here. So this was a survey study conducted on 64 teachers in a major state primary school. Now, we're making an assumption here that this primary school is representative of other primary schools. So if you can agree with us on that assumption, then we can interpret the findings in this sense. So 64 was enough to come up with statistically significant trends. So let's move on from the assumption that this school does represent other schools, and we can make generalized claims about all primary school educators in multi-schools. So these are the research questions, which I've already pretty much described. I'll keep it swift. I'm already cutting into our break session. These are the research questions, so as I said, let's measure philosophical orientation. We'll do that by taking into account Sultana's delineation of philosophical positions. What are our attitudes towards inclusion? How do these interact, and what factors influence them? So what did we measure? The factors that I'm talking about in terms of them measuring the outcomes of philosophical orientation and attitudes towards inclusion, these were the factors. So this was a survey of these 64 teachers. So we were able to very easily ask them, what role are you in? So we had kindergarten educators, learning support educators, class teachers, and other teachers. It was very easy for us to say, okay, how long have you been in this role? So that's their years of experience. It was very easy for us to ask about their initial training and their ongoing training. So we looked at these factors, we recorded, we measured these factors so that we could see, do these help us predict where they stand philosophically and where they stand in terms of their attitudes towards inclusion? So this was relatively easy to measure. I'm using the word measure a lot. But these are the factors, these are the variables that we started with. Now for the outcomes. So how did those influence these? This is what we were really interested in trying to capture. Attitudes towards inclusion is easy because there's a few scales out there in the literature that are validated, and they help us to come up with some kind of measure. So when I say a measure, what I mean is this scale, for instance, it consists of a range of items, of statements about inclusion, and each of those statements is accompanied by a linear scale, 1 to 6, 1 strongly disagree, 6 strongly agree. We then take the average. So for any individual participant, we ask you to rate your agreement with those statements. We get an average, and then we get one score that represents your attitude towards inclusion. If it's over 3.5, we know you're in favor. If it's under 3.5, we know you are against. So that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. Now, naturally, I know this is a very reductionist way. We're talking about philosophy, so this is reductionism par excellence. However, we were looking at relationships. So we wanted to correlate these variables. So there's one way of doing it. So there's one way of approaching this study. Naturally, the paper will have more details as to how exactly we did this. So this was easy. This is a pre-existing scale. What was a little bit more tricky was, how do we measure those philosophical orientations that Sultana talks about? That's a little bit more difficult because while there are scales out there that help us to measure philosophical positions, they typically focus on what we might call big P philosophies. So realism, idealism, stuff like that. Are you on board with the ideas of one of those camps? But we wanted something more applied, so philosophy of education more specifically. Even there are scales that help us to measure, are you in favor of perennialism, essentialism, pragmatism, progressivism? These are different philosophies of education. But once again, we wanted it to be locally contextualized, so we wanted to base this on Sultana. So we had to come up with our own way. So we had to come up with a construct to measure the position whereby teachers feel that education is utilitarian, it leads to work, it leads to employment, it leads to a healthy economy in financial terms. So we've called this philosophical orientation to utilitarian education for work and economic development. Let's just call this utilitarianism, right? So this is a utilitarianist position. The other position is the other pole, so this is the philosophical orientation to inclusive education for personal and social development. So let's just call this progressivist, right? So we can say utilitarian and progressive on the other side. So we had to measure these two. So as I said, this was the trickier part. So we agreed on some statements that we can measure in the same way as the attitudes towards inclusion. So we captured the utilitarian philosophy with these statements. We asked the participants to rate their agreement. So we used a 5-point scale. 1 strongly disagree, 5 strongly agree. If it's more than 3, you're in favor of that position. If it's less than 3, then you're not. And we also looked at these expressions. Now, these can be scrutinized. These are open to discussion. This is what we agreed on. And we did actually run a confirmatory factor analysis to see how well the items loaded on those constructs. And we were satisfied with the statistics that this yielded. So we went ahead and we said, yes, this is measuring what we wanted to measure. So I've just been given my cue to speed up a little bit. So what were the results? Let me try to go through these very quickly. We tested these using a range of hypotheses. So the hypothesis for what are the general attitudes towards inclusion. This, again, was easy. If the average is more than 3.5, then teachers are in favor. However, we used a hypothesis here. So we used inferential statistics here. Specifically, we used the confidence interval. Now, if we're not, for those of us who are not fully on board with what confidence intervals measure, it's a little bit like throwing darts at a big dartboard. You draw a circle around 95. Let's say you throw 100 shots, draw a boundary around the closest central 95 shots, and you say, does this boundary include the bullseye, or does it not include the bullseye? So the bullseye here being the population parameter we're trying to estimate. So what is the true feeling out there? What is the true position out there? So what we found from constructing these confidence intervals around these average values was that the participants were, let me show you, these are the actual figures. So in terms of attitudes towards inclusion, which is the first one, the TAIS, they were in favor above 3.5. So lower bound here is 3.8, above 3.5. So we can say with 95% confidence that educators are on board with inclusion. So it's a way we can generalize from the sample. We always say we can't generalize from small samples. How do we do it? Well, this is how we do it, right? You can use confidence intervals to do this. So we did the same for utilitarian and progressive approaches. This is what was interesting. Educators are in favor of all of them. So if I really have to summarize, I've got lots of data here to show you. But if I had to really summarize this, the main take-home points from this analysis was that educators are on board. Let me just go back. They are on board with a utilitarian approach, but they're more on board with a humanistic approach. So they're on board with both, but they're more on board with the humanistic approach. And this increase was statistically significant. In fact, the simplest way of looking at this is that the confidence intervals do not overlap, so they are separated. So we can conclude that teachers are more on board with a humanistic philosophy. However, they are on board with both. So for me, and I've just been given my signal to really hurry up now. So round up, right? Okay, what we can say from this, or at least our interpretation, given we introduced Peter Mayall, given we spoke about a critical approach to interpreting education and philosophy of education, what I see this as is a lack of criticality. Because if we had a true awareness of critical pedagogy in Maltese educators, there would be antagonism here. So these would be antagonistic. We would expect an inverse correlation between the humanist and the utilitarian. We don't. We see both. So this is one take-home point. Now, to really wrap up now, I've got plenty more slides here, but we won't go through all of them. These are some of the graphs that we outputted. Let me just finish with this. A take-home point for us as practitioners. We found interesting findings in terms of factors which role is more inclusive than the other. Once again, I invite you to read the paper. There's all the details there. So there were differences among roles, among years of experience, your initial training and so on. These affected all these outcomes. So once again, we can provide more detail on these. Take-home point, we should dedicate some more attention to reflecting and examining our philosophical orientations. Ongoing training, as the data do suggest as well, is a great opportunity to do that. So instead of simply reinforcing relatively superficial perspectives on policy, we encourage educators to reflect on the underlying philosophical assumptions, because we are making an assumption here that your philosophical beliefs, they have some indirect effect on your behaviors. So if we can get educators to reflect more, they have the tools they need to be critical. We talk about critical thinking. I'm talking here about critical theory, critical pedagogy, which goes deeper than simply problem solving. We need to address this more, we need to focus this more, preferably on our ongoing training with our educators. That's all I have time for. I wish I could speak a little bit longer, but thank you very much. Thank you.